All right, let me give this a sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan. And as a co-host today, we have a close friend and also the guest on episode 13, Arianna.
Yes. So, hi, everybody. This is Arianna.
And as a guest today, we are sitting with Anja.
Hi, this is Anja.
And Anja, why don't we start off with you telling us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, great. So my name is Anja-Xiaoxing Cui. I am at the University of Vienna. I am an assistant professor there in the Department of Musicology. And my research is mostly on music psychology.
Yeah. And so what kinds of things do you work on in music psychology?
At the moment, I'm working on a project where we investigate how infants listen to music or listen to song, what features of song they're interested in and what they're paying attention to. And I'm also working on a project where we're investigating whether working with patients who have an Alzheimer's diagnosis and teaching them singing over a greater period of time will modify their memory for music.
Right. And so how do you quantify the memory of music?
This is a great question. I think there are different ways in which I am so sorry. There are different ways in which we can measure memory for music. Obviously, the easiest one for working with adults is probably just to ask you whether you have a memory of this music or not. It gets more difficult when you're working with special populations that maybe aren't able to provide this explicit answer to you. But there are some approaches that you can take, and the one that we have chosen is to use electroencephalographic measures, EEG measures, where in a particular paradigm you can use an EEG marker that indicates whether you have a memory of this melody or not, to test whether they will develop this memory over the course of time. And of course, it would be fantastic if the participants would also be able to provide this explicit check of whether they have this memory of music. But the idea is that even if they cannot, we will be able to tell.
And so what does the experiment look like? Are you playing music and are you just trying to see at which point individuals can recognize rhythm? Or is there another purpose to the experiment?
Mm-hmm. The recognition that we check is melodic recognition. And so the way the experiment works is that we have these melodies and we change them slightly. We change them in a way that is musically legal. So it doesn't sound bad, but if you know the song, you go, hold on, that's not the song. And so this particular moment of disruption leads to a particular deflection in the EEG that we can track.
And I'm curious, the fact that it's musical content, does it make major difference for the memory retrieval process? Or, of course you're interested in music and obviously that's what you study, but I was wondering if this is like a mechanism that you can generalize to other content, or... I'm going to give you my personal answer that I believe, and then I'm going to kind of add some science to it. I think it's a bit different. I think our memory for music is a little bit different. And there is some research that I believe supports this hypothesis. So we see that in some Alzheimer patients, actually, we can use music to evoke autobiographical memory, where other stimuli do not. And we also see in some patient cases, and this is not Alzheimer patients, patients who have had damage to their medial temporal lobe, that they were able to learn new music and that they develop memory for this music. Not an explicit one, but an implicit one. And I think the reason why music is a little bit different than many other contents that we want to store in our memory system is that it contains motoric aspect. Okay.
And where, there's all this research showing that in the medial temporal lobe, the degeneration is faster in Alzheimer patients. if that is the case, then a content that we want to learn or store or memorize that doesn't exclusively depend on the medial temporal lobe is going to work better.
Right.
And that's why we're trying it with music.
That's really interesting, and I think that also can be true for some images, for some video, like images or memories of actions, or you know, I guess the fact that they are composed by different elements. Yeah. And I was wondering if you are going to, I mean, your interest is in seeing whether Alzheimer patients can develop new memories then, like implicit new memories, right? You're not looking at the autobiographical recall, right? So that's really interesting.
I think it's a first step, though, to ideally you then want to help people protect their access to autobiographical memories. There's some data that we have where we looked at the video recordings of Alzheimer patients as they were retrieving autobiographical memory that were evoked by song or that were evoked by music. So music evoked autobiographical memory, also called meme. And what we saw in these video recordings is that there is a certain level of gesturing when you're recalling or when you're telling the story of the autobiographical memory. And we specifically looked at the gestures that occurred prior to them recalling the memory. So in a way, just on the basis of the time period, gesturing during the recall, during the actual recalling of the memory. And there are some differences in terms of what those gestures are between younger adults, older adults who do not have an Alzheimer's diagnosis, and the participants who have an Alzheimer's diagnosis, where the Alzheimer diagnosis participants are much more likely to engage with the music in a gestural way. So it's something about the movement to the music, we think, that helps them recall the autobiographical
like
memory.
A reenactment that supports the other sensory modality.
Exactly. Almost kind of, you can view this in the framework of embodiment.
Right.
You can view this in this framework of a sensory motor trace for the memory. But yeah, so that's, I think, obviously the main goal is to see whether this memory occurs or whether we can create these memories. But then my interest in this work is also on this mechanistic level. Like, what is it about the movement? So we will have the video recordings. Is it about structural places in the music? All of those things that we can then ask. But yeah, the because it's a clinical trial, the main outcome, of course, is do we see the memory? And also, we are going to have some neuropsychological measures. Do we see an improvement in these neuropsychological measures?
Yeah, right. And with the linking to motor, is it that there's a lot of evidence that motor doesn't necessarily need something like hippocampal activity to be stored? Is that what the theory is based on? Yeah. So I guess going back to the very basic Tolving work, that procedural memory is stored somewhere else. That's kind of where this idea comes from. And then I think we can get a little bit bogged down by how we define things. So is your memory for music really truly semantic if it still contains procedural elements? And then we can argue about that. But it is still a memory for the music. Yeah.
And is this sensory motor aspect of it also, you think, in the development, in the early development of this memory? So do you see like infants or children having a more action-based, I would say motion-based approach to memory or to music memory? Or
that's a great question. I don't know. Actually, the age group that we look at for the infant experiment, we chose specifically because they can't move too much.
Okay.
It's just easier to have them in the lab when they can't move yet.
Terrible to have moving babies in experiments are the worst.
So I can't answer the question regarding development, but we do know that kind of movement to music becomes more rhythmic throughout development. So we don't, like, babies don't start being good dancers in that regard. They develop their ability to become rhythmic creatures in a way. But you know what happens when we listen to music while we think about the emotions that are portrayed in the music? Our motor system is active. And so, in a way, even when you're just engaging with music, not even rhythmically or like by dancing or motorically, simply by being moved by the music and the emotions in the music, we are moving to the music. So maybe in that sense, music is also special.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, the idea of being moved by music and activating the motor cortex, I mean, that's phenomenal.
That's dancing, no?
Yeah,
Isn't
yeah.
Dancing, that?
No, but the idea that you can sort of metaphorically, poetically be described as moving, that's really, do you see motor activity when you have rhythmic components in music added? Like, is the motor cortex necessary for processing, interpreting rhythm?
Yeah, actually, that's where we see it most often.
Okay, right.
Or in this context is where we investigate motor activity during music listening most often, is when we look at rhythm. But also if we ask participants to be moved emotionally. I sound so esoteric when I talk about this, music moves you. But it is true. Yeah. It is actually literally true.
Yeah, exactly. It's your motor cortex.
It's your motor cortex.
Yes. That's really cool.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so do you have emotional evocations from stimuli that aren't musical also triggering the motor cortex, or is it purely music triggered?
I think that is a blind spot in my knowledge, and I wouldn't really know because I would have to investigate that. I think there's something special though about music because it has this kind of inherent rhythmical structure that maybe other stimuli do not have. I am often moved by art, static art. Is that going to trigger my motor cortex?
I mean, some people doing research on aesthetic experience, like inspired by this school of mirror neurons theory, actually do show. I mean, I don't want to express any judgment on the studies. I just want to say that there are studies that are looking at this, whether looking at art, such like mainly modern art, that maybe where you can infer the type of movement that has been performed by the artist in order to produce that kind of output. For example, the famous Fontana painting with the fabric that is ripped apart seems to elicit like a premotor kind of or motor premotor kind of response, which according to the authors suggests that you are imagining the action performed by the artist when producing that. Okay. But it's not something extremely established, I think, and I'm also not an expert in this, so I don't want to say anything wrong for that.
Well,
what does Duchamp's water fountain evoke?
So there are limits, obviously. So, and if you pick very specific artistic, very specific paintings where this is so obvious, then obviously you're gonna find what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Of course. I don't know to what extent it's do you know the artist Yayoi Kusama? Yeah, of course.
So of course I think her most famous work are those mirror rooms, but her paintings are very process oriented, and when you see them, you see the motoric action that was repeated over and over again to produce these works. And I find them very, very interesting. And I can totally imagine that when I am perceiving these artworks, that my motor art cortex is like, oh my God, imagine having to do these tiny circles over and over and over again. But what do you do when you see something by Yves Klein?
Yeah.
It is still moving me, but I doubt that I can comprehend or even imagine what he had to do to create this uniform blue.
I guess that's really affected by how opaque is the creative process. So I imagine that if you were really expert in that technique, maybe that would be possible for you to imagine on a motoric level as well. Yeah. But I don't know. Yeah, as I said, it's just an interesting thing that I think the concept that arts move people, it's not... I mean, some other scientists have thought about it in different domains. Yeah.
I think also I want to say that music is a little bit special because if you take away songs which have lyrics, music is very abstract, and you are free to associate whatever you would like. It doesn't tell you unless you have read the program notes and someone who's very informed in musicology may have told you what to imagine. But music is free in that way. And of course, abstract art is as well. But that distinguishes those two art forms from figurative painting, and it distinguishes it from film.
Right.
Yeah, I want to just circle back on one thing that popped to mind is when you remove the rhythmic aspects of music, if it's just tonal, sporadic tones,
right?
What happens to people's perception? Yeah.
I don't think we know too well. In general, science in this field has the tendency to remove aspects as systematically as possible until you have distilled the only thing that you are interested in. And so if you are not interested in rhythm, the easiest way to do this is to have an isorhythm, meaning having the same length of tone over and over and over again. And I am culpable in the same regard. My PhD thesis only had isorhythmic tone sequences. It sounded horrible. One participant actually told me, "Did you put this in your ethics?" That it was going to sound awful.
Oh my God.
I felt a little bit hurt, but all right. And so what you mean by taking away rhythm is an interesting question to me. Do you mean producing isorhythms?
No, I mean if you were to play a single note on an organ for a prolonged period of time and then follow it up with another sound for another period of time where there's sort of a crescendo just in that one note and then follow up with another, but at different paces, but where all you're doing is experiencing a, say, 5 to 10 second crescendo of a single note.
Right. Okay.
Or a chord.
I don't know whether there's any research in that. If you were changing the pitch in some way from note to note, you are automatically introducing rhythm.
So what's coming to mind incidentally is I was with Arianna's son and we were playing on my piano. Right. And it's a sort of an electric Yamaha, it's a synthesizer. So I changed it from the piano setting to this like synth thing that sounds like an 80s melodrama, right? And I played a chord, and it was quite a sad chord, but they're weighted keys. So as you press down, the sound crescendos.
Yes.
And he got very upset.
Why?
There's no rhythm, just the sound.
Yeah. Just the sound.
But that's also something that exactly similarly came to mind. Again, thinking about him, because I can't undo my knowledge of music.
Yes.
So I know, things associate in my mind already based on so many things.
What music is supposed to sound like.
Exactly. Yes. But for him, it's not the case. And he's a very musical kid, so he really likes music. And he has very strong emotional responses to different sounds.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where music, that's where there is something not free in a sense. There are sounds that resonate with certain emotional states. And I don't know if that's innate or that's natural. I don't know where that comes from. But I can see that, a minor chord affects emotions in a very I don't want to say deterministic, but kind of non-random way, let's say.
Yes.
Is that true, or
this is true?
Just, okay.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to kind of state with a level of confidence that I think would be good here. But
no confidence statements.
I am always suspect when people say minor chords must be sad or major chords must be happy. I think it really reduces the music in a way. But there is research showing that across multiple cultures that a minor third, which is a distinguishing characteristic of a minor chord, as opposed to the major third, has associations with sadness more so than with happiness. And it might have something to do with how our voice prosody falls when we express sadness or happiness. And in that case, then, perhaps there's something natural about it. Mm-hmm. But I think, kids are amazingly open to what music could sound like. Mm-hmm. I always think about, though, of this anecdote that I heard. I'm not even sure who told me first, but about a colleague who had read all of the science about mere exposure effects and had decided that for his child, he was going to curate a listening biography that would create a kind of sophisticated listening child. And so this child received a lot of Schönberg in its musical education, but grew to hate the composer. So I don't really know, you know. There are so many factors at play.
But what were you saying? You were saying, sorry, about the prosody is also very interesting, because I think that different languages have so different prosodies. I don't know, is that a universal, that when we are sad we sound more minor than? Like, is that true for all languages?
I don't think it has been studied for all languages.
But it has studied. I find it hard to believe, right?
Yeah, it has been studied for English and I am going to butcher this. I think a language that is spoken in India. Now, don't ask me which one it was.
But maybe it is a universal fact, and I'm just ignorant about it. I just imagine the difference in prosody between, I don't know, just Italian and German. I don't need to go very far.
Yes.
They're even bordering countries, but the prosody is...
And we haven't even spoken about tonal languages, where prosody also carries meaning.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether that is true, but people have certainly tried to look into it. Yeah. I'm not sure whether I believe it too hard.
Right.
Yeah. There are a bunch of things I want to circle back on, but this might be a good time to dive into another aspect of your research, which is cultural interpretations of music and feelings evoked by music over time. You have this really fun set of work looking at historical perceptions of music. Yeah. Can you go into that?
Right. So this is work that I do with a music historian. And he was really interested, or I should probably explain where he started and where I came on and where we landed. So he's a historian who's very interested in horror.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's all good.
Horror. You said
horror and
my bottle.
Your bottle could not handle it.
The Monkey Dance podcast now with sound effects.
He's interested in horror. Ta-dum! He's interested in horror music, and he was interested from a historic perspective. He started with film music in the 20th century, where it came from. So he started looking back and back and back, but then it became harder and harder for him to find horror music, and so he eventually decided that maybe he would need to look in the 19th century for music that at that time was perceived by listeners in that time as horror adjacent. Now, sources from that time are not always organized in a way that is searchable. And you cannot travel back in time to ask listeners how they perceive the music. So he asked me whether I'd be interested in kind of looking at music perception from a historic perspective. We looked at sources from newspapers and diaries, whatever was available in a particular digital database, where I will refer to them invariably as participants, even though they did not participate in my research. But okay. Whether the listeners, the 19th century listeners, when they used words like unheimlich to describe music. Unheimlich, we can translate as uncanny. And then basically to look at the music that was described as uncanny to see whether there's any sort of relationship between what is described as uncanny and what is a musical feature. Then, of course, we could then go back and kind of thinking about this to say, what music was described as sad? And do we find these idioms there as well? I would wager yes, because we weren't very adventurous in looking for where these sources came from. It's easiest to start with what you know, of course. And so these are participants from the German-speaking countries. And this is the time when a lot of the composers composed that we still listen to today. So I think something like sadness or happiness, emotions that have been encoded in music for a very, very long time, and in a way that we still understand today, will probably sound the same. But when something is a bit more subtle, like uncanniness, then maybe we have a chance to look at this through this historic lens to see whether things stay the same or whether things change. But one of the things that we found in our most recent analysis, where we looked at, so we used something called multiple correspondence analysis to look at which words were often used together to create a Euclidean space in which we can project the terms that we use to describe the music. And then we can project into this space the music that was associated with these terms, extract audio features of this music, and then correlate the dimensions that we find in this Euclidean space in terms of the words, and the descriptions that we used, and the audio features. And what we find, for example, is that there is kind of this, there's this dimension that we find in the descriptive space that goes from düster, I guess it could be translated as dark in a way, or like sinister, to gespenstisch, or more eerie. And so if you think about what sinister means and what eerie means and what the music might sound like, you would perhaps intuitively say that the eerie music is probably softer in volume. And this is what we also find in the recordings. Many shortcuts were taken in producing this result. For example, there are so many recordings of each piece. And so which recording do you choose? And all of those things are decisions that you take in kind of doing this kind of research. But so we are able to kind of look into a little bit music perception in the 19th century, which is, I think this is so cool. It's definitely cheaper than developing a time machine.
I thought, I was really... what you just said really made me curious, because I was thinking maybe some reason why music has this cultural power is also this ability to jump from music to other modalities so easily. Mm-hmm. Like what you just said, eerie sounds like soft in volume. Eerie maybe also sounds like something, I don't know, pointy rather than round, Mm-hmm. There are so many possible associations in other modalities that you can make from music that I don't think it's so wildly free with other type of stimuli. Mm-hmm. And then maybe that's how some cultural things related to music can be transmitted, that stick more through generations, or through different traditions, because they're sort of also so flexible.
Right. Yeah. I would say so. I was actually reading something the other day, and it was an English translation of a French text. And in this English text, they were pointing out cross-modal correspondences in a way between sounds in language and what they signify.
Right.
And what was written in English, and I'm going to try to recall this, is that the word for nose in many languages contains the word N, which is kind of a nasal sound. And the word for tongue in many languages contains the letter L. And that arrested me in my reading, because the word tongue does not contain the letter L, because it was an English translation of the French original, in which tongue was langue. Yeah. And where, there's an L. And there was another example that also didn't work in English. And, and we are kind of quick to assign these correspondences in our own language. And I thought, oh, this is curious. So I was looking into the French original, where all of the examples worked, and in English only the nose one worked. And then I thought, I also speak other languages. What is this going to be like in Chinese? And the word for nose in Chinese, or in Mandarin, which is what I speak, is 鼻子. There's no N at all. So none of these worked. But I think music is a little bit different, because it's we can free it from meaning. Yeah. And so we can have these cross-modal correspondences without having to conform to semantics.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I think about the perception of art, you have so much of art is visually perceived, but then you have two major sort of oral forms of art, which are music and something like poetry. And so these two things can be paired with the visual domain often, because there's such a wide breadth of visual type of art. It's kind of odd to pair dancing and painting at the same time. People do it. But it's much easier to pair poetry or music with painting or sculpture or dance or whatever it is. And I suppose there's an added benefit to pairing music with something as opposed to poetry with something, or I guess it depends on what you're trying to do, but one implicitly has meaning, or we can impart meaning on it, but it's kind of devoid of it explicitly. And the other one explicitly does have meaning, unless you're just saying random words, which still would have meaning. So I guess there's something interesting there for me with music, in that when I think about the emergence of music, maybe it's taking it too far back, but the first time I sort of came across the question of where music emerged was when going through sort of the early works in the masters of reading folks like William James and then Darwin. And James seemed to have this view, this kind of how I'm reducing it in my head, or how I reduced it at the time. I don't know if it still holds up. But how James had this view that essentially it was bootstrapped, scaffolded on top of our capacity for language and our deference to interact with others, and that music was somehow emerged from the complexity that already existed. Right. Whereas Darwin in The Ascent of Man puts forward a bunch of different theories as to why music might have emerged, comparing it to birdsong, essentially trying to make an evolutionary argument for the emergence and maintenance of music as an artifact. Is there somewhere where you sit on that spectrum?
I am agnostic in that fight. I have such huge respect for my colleagues who are looking into the evolution of music. There are many ideas out there, and I fear that we will never know for sure, based on the scarcity of experimental evidence where we can create. In investigating this question, there was a very good issue in a journal, which I cannot recall, where two competing ideas about the origins of music were put forth. One positing that music evolved as a signal for size and a signal for resources, broadly speaking. And the other one as a way to cooperate with others. And the reason I really liked this issue in this journal is because apart from these two theories that were posited and underfed with a lot of evidence that was gathered to kind of support these theories, they had comments from a lot of others who added additional evidence for one of the theories or evidence against one of the theories or pointed out oversights in those theories. So after having read this, I think it's well over 100 pages of smart people thinking smart thoughts, I have come away saying I don't know. And I don't believe in one more than the other. But I find it very interesting to think about, yeah.
Yeah, and there's one that I think about often, not necessarily because it's convincing, but because I think it opens up a whole other set of thoughts, is music as emotion regulation. It was put in the context of parent to child and sort of soothing and even regulating the emotions of others, essentially, from that parent-child context. But because you were speaking about music moving individuals, do you see music as something like a tool also for emotion regulation other than everything else?
Right. Whether as for us.
Yeah, like in that...
As pro artis. Yeah and no. I don't think personally I need music to be anything other than what it is. But I certainly don't mind it when people use music to regulate their own emotions. It certainly seems to work, and a lot of people do it. And it's very powerful in that way. And perhaps less unhealthy than chocolate, which is what I do.
I wanted to go back to the previous question, what are the origins of music? And I have a background my interest is in social interactions, cooperation, and how people coordinate with each other. And one obvious function of music is coordination. And that's also the function of, I think, some music-like outputs in other species, or it has been discussed that way. And so that's always created a very convincing parallel for in favor, sort of pushing me towards the idea that music is not a byproduct of a language development per se, because we can see music used in similar ways in species that don't necessarily develop the language, such as, the same way we did. But apart from the big debate, which I'm super ignorant about, I think I always found it really interesting, the idea that it's a coordination tool. And of course, for those who study coordination and cooperation, everything is a coordination tool, right? Right. But I don't know. I'm curious. What are your thoughts on it?
I think it works very powerfully as a coordination tool. Music does. But I think my problem with these evolutionary theories is that I can at the same time believe that it is a very powerful, a powerful cooperation tool without thinking that it developed or originated or evolved to become, because it is a powerful cooperation tool.
Yeah.
So I think this is where I stand, is that this all sounds great and it would explain why it works as a cooperation tool. But then also, because other people study it from this emotion regulation perspective, why did it then not evolve also as an emotion regulation tool? Because I guess
emotional regulation and coordination are also related in the way that, let's say that if you imagine that there is a social matrix, social function, then coordinate. In order for people to coordinate with each other, they need to, first of all, be emotionally attuned to each other, and second of all, be in an emotional state that allows them individually for cooperation.
I see, okay.
So these two aspects are not far off. They all come, in my understanding, from the idea that music is with us as humans for a social purpose, not as something that would have evolved if we weren't so geared towards sociality and prosociality in general, which is, I think, for me very convincing, but also, again, I said, I'm biased, obviously.
Yes, and I think one of the arguments that was brought up over and over again in these comments is that what we view today as music, as opposed to language, as opposed to other things, human artifacts in a way, we will never know what it sounded like in the past. And so it's hard for us to imagine music being in any other way than it is in the form that we know it as today. And so there are some saying, music is a better cooperation tool than language. But maybe music didn't sound like this in the past. So would that still have been a good cooperation tool, better than language? One of, I think, the most interesting thought experiments that one of the comments posited is to think about what is like music to you without being music. Like what's like music but isn't music, the way in which we define it. And some of the answers that came up I thought were very intriguing. Of course, there are like nature sounds that can sound musical to us, but then some of the answers that were brought up are just like a good conversation. That can be like music to you. Or it can be, in one of the examples that was brought up, the laughter of a child. That can be like music to you. Or cooking, a good meal. That can be like music to you without actually being music. So if we ask, what is music, or what encompasses music, or what fulfills the same functions of music, maybe we'd have a broader understanding of its true function.
I'm thinking now all of the things you said have in common, at least for me, the fact that they're all very rewarding. So, and that's also something I'm always very curious about. What's the reward processing? What's the reward system doing while we listen to music, and how
it's doing a lot.
I know, I can tell. But I mean, I think what's putting together all of this experience that are like music but are not music, I think is the fact that they're rewarding.
Yeah, so maybe then we should be... But how would you tie this to a music for cooperation idea?
Well, because I think also cooperation is very rewarding.
Okay.
So activities that... rhythm is rewarding. Synchrony is rewarding. Imitation is rewarding. All of this synchrony, imitation, and rhythm are also strongly part of musical performance.
Okay.
So there are things that put these elements together. Yeah, but not in a systematic way. These are only I'm just thinking out loud now.
Yeah, I agree with rewarding. The thing that came to mind is emotion, an affective reward. And I think that a lot of these things provide the affective reward. And I was wondering if when people say it's like music, it's that the outcome of this thing provides the sort of same positive affective state that listening to music provides. And I think cooperation provides us a real affective reward as well. This feeling of goodness, of solidarity, this reduction of my social uncertainty is sort of met when I cooperate. And a couple of things came to mind when listening to you two. One was, if you've ever been in a drum circle, that time sort of dilates. It really becomes a non-factor, and you can very much get lost in the drum circle with a group of people. And so one question, it's great to have both of you here for this, is the difference between music production, joint music production versus joint music listening. Right. So if you look at two individuals who are producing jazz, I know a lot of joint action folks have looked at two people cooperating on a piano, even in this department. And versus, if you have a baby who's listening to music, do the parents have headphones on as well? Mm-hmm. Is it different if the infant only has headphones versus they know that there's a signal to them that the parent is listening to the same thing?
Right. This is an interesting question. So question of joint attention between infants and their caretakers, yeah? So in the experiment that we do, infants come in and they're seated on the lap of their caretaker, and the music is coming from a speaker that's mounted behind the screen. And the parents are wearing headphones because they're listening to something else, because we don't want them to be influencing the infant in any way by indicating rhythms to the child. And we've had to throw out a bunch of data because infants sit in the lap. They look at a screen and it's colorful. There are colorful squares on the screen. It's so fun. There's music. And what I think happens a lot is that the infant wants to show their parent or caretaker what's happening. They move back, including the entire EEG setup, and go, "Mom, look at the screen." And mom is like, "I am a good scientist helper. I will not react." And this is when a lot of participants, when a lot of the infants go, "I don't want to participate in this anymore." But so I have witnessed this a lot, that the joint attention is something that can be rewarding in itself, yeah. But I don't really know whether that is the main focus of any of the research. We don't record them doing this. This is simply from a video feed that we watch to make sure that the infant is happy while they're in the room. But yeah, I have had to throw out a lot of data because of that.
Yeah, that is interesting that they're ostensibly receiving some kind of reward from the music itself.
Yeah.
But then they're looking for an even greater reward to supplement the reward with a joint reward.
Yeah,
exactly.
And that's quite interesting.
I think that's a lot of research has been done on this, not a lot, but some people interested in this prosociality, mimicry, synchrony, have studied how infants and parents, what is the effect of synchronizing, even just bouncing with your child, which is a very, very elementary form of, I guess, dancing, but also, I think, performing music together in a sense. So I think it's on a spectrum. This joint attention to an external stimulus and performing music, if you consider moving in rhythm to the music, a precursor of what could be performing music yourself, they're not so far. They're not in opposition, let's say. I think I see them on a continuum.
Yeah, well, we've come back to the fact that music kind of moves you automatically, right?
Exactly.
And so that when you're listening to music together, there's this external stimulus that helps you be together.
Yes.
And whether you are actually producing the music together or not then becomes secondary. I think this is why people love going to live music events. It's because you're actually listening to something together.
And they are also producing. It's a productive event,
right?
For the people in the audience. It's rarely. Unless it is and it's. Okay, I take it back. It's not necessarily productive in the sense I imagine live performance where I can move. Mm-hmm. But I think it's productive in the sense of music, producing shared meaning.
Yes.
Totally. Going to an event, a musical event together, it creates some special connection between people. Obviously, you can say the same for a theater play or, for a movie, but can you really say the same for... No, because I think the narrative takes over. When there is a narrative to the story, then the possibility for you to create that shared meaning is also a bit more, constrained by the existing narrative.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm thinking what also narrative creating, meaning creation is performing together.
Right.
Right? Like there you really need to create a shared narrative.
Yeah.
Which is not necessarily in the physical motoric domain, really in the music domain.
I always find this kind of strange, but I should say that I do not really engage in sports or care too much about sports. But the only other place in which I have witnessed this kind of togetherness is in sports watchers.
Yeah, it's true. It's really true.
But even then, it is often aided by music.
Yeah, true.
It is someone bringing a huge drum and creating a rhythm, and then whole sections of a stadium creating a soundscape together, where this kind of where you kind of see this effect, and I love seeing these videos that people take in stadiums of music concerts that are just so in awe of kind of the synchronized display of people waving lights or people dancing or people singing, because it is truly something awe-inspiring to see so much coordination together, and that every single person that's listening to the same thing is kind of experiencing the same thing, perhaps even the same awe that you're experiencing, and I find that very fun and beautiful.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see different types of music having different listening styles. Mm-hmm. So if you're in a classical setting, there are some cultures where the classical setting is extremely rigid, and you listen only to the music, and it's actually the attempt to create a solitary listening experience. Yes. Versus something where you're at a huge concert and people are also singing along. This drastic difference is, I think, representative of what music is used for, whether it's purely for an individual experience or whether it's for some kind of group activity.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true of sports, in that if you really want to watch a match, I mean, it's recorded so you can watch it later again. But if you're really excited about a match, going to the match is not the best way to watch the match.
Right.
So it's actually better to watch it on the television because you get a much better sense of what's going on in the sport.
That is correct.
But for the team experience, for the group experience, especially if you're a diehard fan of a team more than the sport, then you really want to go to the stadium.
My mother has never been really interested in sports either, and in fact has always been afraid of going to a stadium where there's so many people, and often, there's a certain level of testosterone in the air. It wasn't attractive to her. But my brother-in-law works for a sports team, and so brought her along to a Bundesliga game. And she was so excited. She called me afterwards and said, Anja, I had always wondered, this is soccer, by the way, I had always wondered what the goalie of the team was doing while everyone was in the other side of the field. And I finally know. And for her, it was rewarding in a different way.
Anthropologically.
Yes. They're doing stretches. Did you know that? I did not. I had never been. But now I know.
But I think what you're saying also maybe it's a social construct rather than a function. Like, I don't know how intellectual the experience is, or how remote from pure enjoyment, or what do we consider enjoyment of something is really not, it's cultural, strictly cultural. And I don't know depending on what kind of classical piece you're listening to, the vibe is huge. You could totally imagine this audience not being sitting and still, but moving like crazy, right? Yeah. So I think really there's nothing about the music in itself that determines those social practices.
Living in a city that is famous kind of for its classical music scene. And I should say I grew up in a classical music environment, and for a very long time I wanted to become a classical pianist, actually. And I love going to concerts here in Vienna. There's so many, and they're so fun. Oftentimes, in one of the halls there's a possibility of getting standing room tickets. Oftentimes I'm in the standing room. Cheaper, more affordable. Also, there's less judgment when I move because I find it so hard to sit still when the music is good. But I am aware that if I am actually sitting in the auditorium, because the seats are connected, when I move, my neighbor has no choice but to move with me, and they might not want that. But I find it very hard. And I love watching the one person in the auditorium who does not care about social norms and is actually moving to the music. And I feel very connected to that person in that sense.
This is great.
But yeah, so if you come see a concert with me, come do it in the standing room, and we will have our own private dance party there. There's one piece that I love. I have never played it myself because I am not a cellist, but it's a Haydn C major cello concerto. And the third movement, I swear, is the danciest tune ever. But so far, every time I've heard it live, I have not been allowed to dance in the way I want to.
Wow, we need to get more cellists making private recording sessions.
Yeah.
So I would be interested to move back into memory for a little bit. And so you and I had spoken about this earlier, but I memorized a lot of poems, and I utilized the memory palace technique of memorizing a series of images and then adding words to that progression of images in order to help me memorize a poem. And it's this interesting thing where as I've been memorizing poems for, I guess, about 14 years now, and it's become easier to do it even without the memory palace. But initially that was necessary, especially for 5-6 years, to scaffold the memory of the explicit wording and the order of the words, couple that with a sequence of images. And so my thought is that, and I guess one other thing is that some of the poems I write, occasionally I write a very theatrical poem for fun, and it's involves me taking up a lot of physical space, right? A lot of gesture and movement. And the gestures also become incorporated as part of the memory. Yeah. It's not like the gestures are different every time. And so my thought was always that coupling different aspects of, or coupling different modalities within yourself helps you remember better. There's also always what I assumed about why music and poetry are coupled together. Right. Because ostensibly the music might help spur the recall of the words. Do you give any credence to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Our memory is multimodal, and so there's, I think, different theories actually come and produce the same prediction, which is that if you have multiple ways in which you can access a memory, it's going to be stronger. And whether that memory in itself, whether the thing that you're trying to remember is in itself multimodal, then I guess takes a back seat. I definitely think that this is true, that when we have multiple ways in which we can remember something by, then it's easier to retrieve that memory. And also, it's also easier to come by this memory again, simply because now when you see one part of it, or when you hear part of it, when you sense another part of it, there's a kind of an access route to that memory. Yeah.
And is that ever something you incorporate in your research, or is it that you focus purely on music?
It is something that I incorporate in my research. So this work on gesturing during memory retrieval is kind of an outcrop of that thought, that the movement that we do inherently when we listen to music becomes a part of the memory, and so that by activating that part of the memory, the movement, we can then retrieve the memory itself. That's the idea of it. the kind of prospective longitudinal research that would actually be necessary to provide the best evidence for this idea, I don't think has taken place. But actually, I have a meeting later today where we are going to brainstorm ideas to kind of get at that. Perhaps using something like transcranial magnetic stimulation to interrupt or enhance motoric activity during memory storage, memory recall, to see whether there's any evidence for that. But I guess this is where this thought comes from.
And I wonder if listening, so the affect and memory, of course, so closely tied together. Mm-hmm. Is it listening with somebody else? Does that serve as a mnemonic tool? Do you remember the affect or reward better if you're singing with your best friend? Does that actually aid in the recall of music or words?
I'm not sure. Perhaps. I haven't thought about it before. Oftentimes because I guess I have been educated in this rigorous experimental paradigm where the participant is in a black room and you're only there with the one participant. Of course, you probably have a better sense for a bigger lab with more people in it. But I would assume that actually that adds to the memory as well. Kind of the music being part of an event that actually ties you to other people. One of the tunes that very, very reliably elicits autobiographical memories in this kind of database, data set that we are investigating regarding the gestures is the bridal march. Because, I'm not sure whether it's actually as common here in Europe than it is in North America, but a lot of weddings seem to feature the bridal march. And a lot of people have an autobiographical memory that is tied to this particular piece of music. And the memory always involves other people because it's at a wedding. So in a sense, that's, maybe add some evidence to this idea that the context in which you're listening to the music is also part of the memory. I always found the paradigm that we use. So basically, it's just 12 pieces of music that had been tested on a larger sample to see like which tunes reliably give you autobiographical memories. I always found that task very difficult for myself because I oftentimes, the memories were so stupid. The memories that I would produce I first listened to this piece at this concert hall. Then I think I also listened to it at this other concert hall. I could not dissociate myself from the music itself. I was so focused on the music and where I had listened to it and the memories associated with the music itself that I was a very bad participant in my own experiment.
Maybe we can turn to Arianna real quick. Do you have something to say on what we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is research on this joint memory effect, on the fact that you have a better recall of events that have happened when someone else is there. But that's not I'm not expert and I don't want to say wrong things about the findings. But research has been done in the context of joint action research, specifically because all of these events are experienced by people in at least pairs. So, I think there is an effect of joint attention for sure. The hypothesis, some of the hypothesis behind is that there is an enhanced recall of events that have been jointly or stimuli that have been jointly attended, which would make a lot of sense, like evolutionary speaking as well. If we both attended to this thing, it means it's important, more important than if this same stimulus was in front of us, but you didn't pay attention to it. That would be a signal that it's maybe something not that relevant in the environment. So I think that would be the theoretical background of the question, and the findings, I don't know, I don't remember them.
Actually,
but, yeah.
So would you consider then, this is speaking, I guess, just from intuition, but most of the times when you go to concerts, you go with someone else. I would say rarely do I go by myself to a concert. This is, I guess, just by virtue of the fact that my partner is also a classical music fan. We go together. But then all of the other people in the auditorium are often in a group, in a pair, a family, whatever. And I think even, most of the times when I go to concerts, I go with someone else. Very rarely do I go by myself. So would that be indicative of that being a driver of our attraction to music?
Whether you do this activity mainly with others rather than alone.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Totally. I mean, anything that is that we consider more rewarding. We go back to the previous point, I guess. Yeah. But really, if you think that experience is more enjoyable with somebody else, although the fact that somebody else is there has no other function rather than sharing the experience, that makes that experience social in and of itself, right? Like that the function of that is to have a social experience.
Okay.
Right? Because you kept on repeating that you have all of these autobiographical memories of you listening to pieces of music in different concert halls, and that was your autobiographical memory. But if that was purely the case, you probably would have been alone every single time. But you were not.
No,
right?
no. I
right. You said,
but
you said you more frequently go to these events with somebody else.
Yeah.
Or with your partner or whatever, with someone relevant for you, right? So it's all. There is more to that experience than the experience itself, and that's why you choose to do it with somebody else, and that makes the experience more rewarding.
Is there anything that you consider when we were talking earlier about the reward system that is better unshared than it is shared?
Loading the dishwasher. Of this, I am 100% sure. No, okay. I don't know. Like, I've been thinking about it. What kind of experience is preferable, like systematically preferable, in a solitary experience than a joint experience? I don't know.
I think for me, it's eating chocolate.
You don't want witnesses?
Because then you have less chocolate?
Good point. Also.
I am happy to share my chocolate, but sometimes the chocolate is just for myself.
Yeah. You also need to be alone in the room.
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
I definitely think there's something to giving ourselves space from people. And I don't know if it sort of resets our reward system or helps us get process, and that processing might be an important component of then being able to enjoy other things. Yeah. And I have to think, I write a lot, and it would be impossible to write a poem with another person.
Is it?
There. You could write the poem together. It would be a shared poem.
Yes.
But as an activity of somebody saying, well, what do you think you will put as the next line? That would be incredibly aggravating.
Yeah.
There's, I think the Phantom Thread covers this quite well, where you need a solitary space in order to create. And because what you're creating is your experience.
Yeah, okay. I have a very similar experience with music listening, in fact, because so you were saying that you have this, this person that was creating the playlist of, to educate his child to be the most, intellectually, musically expert child in the universe. So I listen to a lot of music and I do a lot of playlists. I've done some playlists for my kid, but I do playlists for myself. So they are they are emotional experiences. They are all, it's something I really take time for because it makes me feel better. And this listening phase where I'm collecting things that I want to put together into an emotional soundscape has to be done by myself alone. headphones walking or in the room, but with nobody else. In fact, in the first year of life of my child, where I had to listen, I mean, I couldn't listen to as much music as I used to, especially alone, because there is no such a thing as alone time. And you can't just put headphones on, because that's a very antisocial act, especially to a child. I really missed that. And my experience with music was really shared a lot. And it wasn't as pleasant for me, honestly. Not only
a lot of the music listened to is not as pleasant either.
Indeed. And also me listening to the music I like with other people is not necessarily the way I want to listen music to. For example.
But we need to recognize that this is something new, right? Like the fact that we can listen to music by ourselves is an artifact of technology.
Totally.
That would not have been possible just some 100 years ago. And I think it's incredibly important nowadays, but that's not really, I guess, what could have been the driver.
No. You're right. You're right. It's a total cultural
Back to social rewards.
Yes. Back to social rewards.
There's actually a colleague of mine in Germany who studies kind of the bubble that you create by putting on a pair of headphones and listening to music by yourself, kind of to measure the distance. She actually physically measures the distance that you basically create from other people by wearing a pair of headphones. I found that also very interesting. But yes, do you ever share your personal playlists with anyone else?
Only a selected few.
Yeah. But is it then...
It's really for me or, you know, for people that I share time with, but in intimate ways. It's not like... It's a personal thing.
Yeah.
It's really like... I don't know. I made playlists for other people, and it's like I've written them a letter or something. Yes. It's similar to that.
Yeah, it's very personal.
Yeah, but it's a super personal thing. Yeah, especially the selection process. Like where you end up, because now also something very new because of technology. The access to music database is just endless.
It is so much.
And it's so great. For someone like me, it's great. But also I realize it's a total, it's a bubble. It's something completely, unrealistic.
My father is a great fan of classical music. And for the longest time, he listened to a radio station. And the radio station in the area of Germany where my parents live, that plays classical music. So they have someone explaining the music, and there's the music. And I was trying to find a way to replace the very old beat-up radio that wasn't really working very well anymore for him. And nowadays, radio is an app. And so he was eventually convinced that he could upgrade his phone so he could listen to the radio on the phone. Until I realized that he wasn't actually interested in the radio itself. He was actually interested in music. And I said, Dad, I have amazing news for you. You can just have something like a streaming app, and you can listen to the music on there. So we set him up with a streaming app. And through some circumstances, I was paying for his streaming subscription, which I'm happy to do. But at one point, I said, the free trial phase was over. Dad, do you want to continue this streaming thing? And he said, yes, I haven't finished listening to it yet. And I just had to stop myself from laughing. I said, you will never finish. You will never finish the streaming.
Love it.
What a gift. What a gift.
I also sometimes dream of finishing Spotify.
Yeah, you're at the end. Congratulations. You have reached the end of our streaming catalog.
Yeah.
I don't think it's ever going to happen, though.
No, it's true. It's true.
Yeah, I suppose there is also a relationship with music to kind of pull back to the affective component that we have with particular albums. And this idea that, like making a mixtape, that it's curated, but that in this sense it's curated ideally by your favorite artist or something. And a good friend of mine while we still used to both live in New York, we used to have nights where we would pick an album that either it could be anything we both loved or we both never listened to but loved the artist, and we'd just cook and then sit down and just listen to the whole album the whole way through, just kind of listening to the music, not really talking much. And it's this phenomenal experience where those albums are incredibly salient to me, of course, and it's a profound shared experience because there's also a limited amount of music in an album. And I think that there's something there also in terms of our experience of something, why, say, poetry is always in a sense limited, in that while there's an unlimited amount of poems, people have some kind of shorter attention span for poetry in general, right? But it's this interesting sort of thing where people can almost listen to music at length, but then limiting ourselves to a period of time, just saying, I'm going to listen for this 45 minutes. Something about it enhances the aesthetic experience for some people.
Oh, you mean you've never just sat down and listened to the Mariner all the way through? Or the Iliad? That's a long poem.
Oh, man. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is that there's almost, for people who love poetry, myself included, I mean, I have many nights where 6 hours could go by and it's a few of us reading poems to one another, right? But that doesn't happen for many people.
But would you read 6 hours of poetry? No, by yourself.
On my own? Yeah, I mean, I've spent the whole day reading a book or poems.
Book, I understand. Book I could do.
Yeah.
Poetry, as you said, it's like a format that somehow, I don't know, maybe because it carries, like every word carries so much meaning, or maybe that's my interpretation of it, but there is a different flow to the experience, or it's more intense. It's like it's more in depth than it is for, like, you're not looking for the end of it, or you're not looking to know what's coming next, which is kind of also with music. I mean, if you know music, if you know the album, you're always like, there is a lot of anticipation in listening. And if you are following a plot, maybe there is a lot of curiosity that is pushing you to go, to the next chapter, to the next page. And I don't know if that's the case. I mean, you are the expert, right? So I'm asking you, is that the case with poetry?
No.
Right.
And the goal, not even the goal of the poet, but something that happens in poetry is that the poet attempts to subvert expectation very often. So that happens a lot. There are some forms that are explicitly built on this, like the haiku, which intentionally sets up two lines, and the third line, the cutting stroke, subverts expectation, and that's what makes it a haiku. With poetry, there's a more active component in that one ought not read poetry with their inner voice, but ought to read it out loud to themselves. And so there's this aspect of, even if you're reading poetry alone, you should be reading it out loud to yourself so you can also hear the poem. There's a very different aspect to the perception of poetry that happens when you're actually hearing yourself read it. And so a large part of spending multiple hours reading poetry on your own is reading the poem to yourself, maybe once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times, and then kind of just sitting there and going, huh. And then you kind of just sit there for a bit. And then maybe you read it again, or you read another poem. And
sounds like making music, right?
It sounds like making music, exactly. And so that's why poetry is distinct, in that if you're reading poetry in the same way you're reading a novel, you are just categorically doing it wrong. I mean, there's no, because that's not the way it's meant to be read. It's a short, condensed thing that you take. It's like if you went to a fine dining restaurant, and every dish put in front of you is 2 bites. And instead of kind of having the 2 bites and sitting with it for another few minutes before another dish is brought, they just bring you everything at once and you just shove it all into your face. It's a very different experience.
What you described as a second case is actually how most Chinese food is consumed. And I love it.
Oh, yeah. But that's also how all of my meals are consumed that aren't like a fine dining place where it's a single prepared bite for me to experience, and then kind of for the experience to linger after eating it for several minutes, maybe 15 minutes even. Whereas most of our meals are definitely not that.
Right.
In the same way that conversation is definitely not poetry. Most meals And most conversation ought not be poetry, right? Most meals definitely it would be horrible if you just ate at Michelin star restaurants for the rest of your life and everything was sort of high-end fine dining. Okay. I would personally hate that because I like to sit down with a large plate of food and multiple dishes and everything's there. And then there's a bunch of people just eating and making a bunch of things. But it's a very different experience from a fine dining experience like poetry, which pauses your reality for a moment and says this thing that you do all the time, which is engaging with words or engaging with food, we're separating it out and making a very condensed version of this thing, a small bite, a small piece of text for you to enjoy, process, sit with, and then maybe you can have another if you wish.
Yeah, exactly. Like the weight of this each word or like each combination of words is like tripled, quadrupled compared to the regular piece of text or prose or whatever you usually read. That's why I don't think you can, I mean, when I was asking you, I was thinking you can't listen, like you can't read poetry the way you listen to music. It has to be the way you make music, if anything. And then it's a much more active process. Like it's a different, I don't know. It's heavier on your system than, right? It's also, I mean, active listening can be very active in music. So it's not like just, if you listen to 6 hours of music straight, you're going to be exhausted. So I'm not thinking of it as like if you're active, like really, really listening to everything. But
Yeah, it's in the same way that a concert pianist can glean the entire music from just sheet music. Anybody that reads sheet music can do that. I can do that. But a concert pianist, I'm guessing, has a much deeper experience reading sheet music than I would. Yeah, I can understand exactly what's going on. But they can perhaps even hear an aspect of it in air quotes. But even then, they would say, I have to hear this. And then they would sit down and play it.
I disagree.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Not because I'm a pianist, but because one of the greatest composers, Beethoven, couldn't hear it.
Right. But there is an aspect. Do you think that he didn't feel the music, the oral quality of music?
No, he must have.
Yeah.
And his diary entries where it's just so obvious that he struggled very hard with the fact that he couldn't hear. But the actual physical auditory stimulus isn't necessary.
No, I don't think it's necessary. In the same way that you don't need to read the poem out loud. It's that it enhances the experience. The only reason why Beethoven wanted to hear is because it enhances the experience.
Gotcha. Okay.
And in the same way that what I meant was that if you're reading the sheet music, you understand what the music is. But hearing it is the aspect of the experience, which you don't need to do with a novel, but you do need to do with a poem. And the poet often, I think every poet writes in a way, whether intentionally or not, where the words ought to be heard as well as read. There's a different aspect to the listening of the poem.
Yeah. Actually, one of the reviews that my colleague and I often get when we write about the historic stuff is that in the past, people weren't able to listen to music all the time, right? They had perhaps one chance to go listen to the music being performed. And a lot of the music perception that was being done was actually visual because they had the scores. The scores were the ones that were distributed. And composers got contracts with publishing houses to publish their music so that people could read the music. So it was a different way of engaging with the music. And that the way we would... So ideally, my dream is to compare the perception that we kind of distill from their writings in the 19th century to the perception we have of music today. But the modality in which they perceive may be completely different because they may have read the sheet music and written about, this particular section here sounds uncanny. But it wasn't really sounding. It reads uncanny. And when I would do the same thing today, I don't think I can do that because most people don't read sheet music. So I have to play them a recording and then ask whether it sounds uncanny or not. But so one of the reviews we often get is, you can't compare that. But I think I can because it's still it's still the same text.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think there's also a particular problem with classical music in that it requires an incredible technical proficiency. And we don't have as much live music per capita as we used to. It used to be much more common to go and hear live music. And I think that this has diminished partly because we have so much accessibility to music. Whereas before, the entire professions build around moving from city to city and just playing music, which now people busk, but it's a very particular type of thing. Whereas bardship, every culture has a culture of bards or taverns for actually listening to music, where they were in the background in the same way the bar is playing music. Folks would come nightly to play at many taverns. And so this culture has diminished, maybe because bars can just put on a playlist or put on an album. And so there's something interesting about, though listening to music has become more accessible, listening to live music has become dramatically less accessible, which is this strange sort of compromise that we've made with the emergence of technology. And do you think, does that factor into what you were saying before?
About my current participants not being able to read the music?
It's more that the aspect of the experience of music, because people would be lucky to experience music very rarely in their lives. I think this was specifically, your reference was specifically to classical music.
Got it. Yeah. Right. I have a problem with the word accessible, because even back then, what I meant was works were rarely performed, and the accessibility that we have today is the fact that we can repeat experiences. So even though, of course, the concert itself may never be, or is never going to be, performed in the same way again and again and again, we have access to recordings and we can listen to them over and over again. And I think the fact that we have this choice of repeatability, of repetition, does actually do something to how we perceive music. Where we don't need to actively listen every time, because we can just do it another time. And I actually very rarely, when I listen to music over my headphones, am actively paying attention to it in the same way that I would be doing if it was a live concert. I only very recently, I actually was listening actively to an album on Spotify. And it was a completely different experience, because I had to pause because I was doing something else, and I had to play again, doing something else. And I'm not sure whether many people do that very often.
I have a question about this. I mean, related to this. So when you were saying people were were listening, reading basically music and imagining it. To be eerie or whatever. Their judgment was only based on the reading, not on the listening. I was thinking, from a cognitive perspective, does that mean that these people were better at listening to music? Is that a cognitively... it's definitely cognitively more difficult to read and imagine a sound, if that's what you're doing. So that's where I'm going. Is that what people were doing? Were they actually imagining a sound and imagining the effect, the emotional experience, or the tone, or everything, the texture, anything, the volume, and then making a judgment on this hypothetical perceptual experience? Or were they judging something like a word? Was that a real musical experience in the way that you could... this is not a criticism. It's really a question about the cognitive mechanism behind that task.
I don't know. When I look at scores myself, when it's for piano, I have a very clear and distinct inner soundtrack. I can't say the same thing for an orchestral score.
Right.
So it's hard for me to imagine how that might work. But of course, there are conductors who do the same thing.
Yeah. But the average guy who was purchasing a music sheet for enjoyment, right?
Right.
First of all, able to read music.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And then able to imagine how the music sounded like. Is that the experience of a music listen? It's like a music listening experience, or is it text?
Right. I don't know. That's a very interesting question.
Good EEG experiment.
Yeah, because you were also mentioning like this kind of interesting thing, that exposure and repetition, like there are like two sides of the same problem, like accessibility and repetition. In that case, unless you are a musician yourself, there was no digital or analogic possibility of listening in your house. You probably weren't going to listening to live concerts that frequently.
Okay.
You were not playing it yourself, maybe. So how auditory was that experience in the first place, right?
Right. So I guess whatever I'm saying is limited to the history of music in Europe, which I am more familiar with than in other cultures. But in that time, in the 19th century, not only was music being published, but music was being published in transcriptions. So you had the possibility of obtaining the hot new opera written for piano. And then you could go home and perhaps you had access to a piano.
Maybe piano was a quite accessible instrument.
Quite accessible, perhaps not. With the advent of better metal works, it became more accessible. But so works of music were not always just being read, right? So the way in which it is read could have been like text, but it could have also been an inner auditory experience, or it could have been an actual auditory experience on a different instrument. Then I wanted to also say that there was something else I wanted to say. And I'm trying to grasp for the thought. It is eluding me.
I don't know.
Oh, right. About the average guy buying the music. So in that time period, kind of a new job emerged, which was the one of the music critic. People became very adept at writing about music. Or there was journalism about music. There were like music periodicals that came up. And so I'm not sure how average the writers are that we actually analyze. And this is another criticism of the work that we do, is because our listeners, our participants from the 19th century may have just been way more experienced and involved with music than the ones we would ask to listen to music today.
But they could be musicians.
They could be musicians, and I don't think actually I personally find the criticism is moot, because it's not really about... I don't think that music that we generally perceive as sad is going to turn happy just because someone has more experience.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Would you predict that there is a difference in the type of neural activity we might see between somebody who's learning how to read sheet music and somebody who is a professional musician who reads sheet music all the time? Is there a difference in, the activity which might help us flesh out something like an operationalized definition, sort of data-driven description of the inner experience of somebody reading sheet music?
Let me think. There's a fun experiment that I quite like, where you see activity in the auditory cortex during silence. When you, prior to the silence, were listening to a piece of music that you knew. So your inner ear, we might call it the inner ear, is continuing the music in your head, and you can see the activity in the brain. So in that sense, it wasn't about reading sheet music, right? But I assume that the same thing goes on for someone who can imagine the music when they're reading the sheet music.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's also something about sort of predictive models of the mind and of the brain, and how sans certain stimuli, the brain will attempt to fill in the gaps with what it might expect. Like if you just stare at a white wall, you will see certain things, and it might reflect what you saw earlier in the day. So I guess there's something to be said for the ability to anticipate or generate this internal sensory experience just from the stimuli, just from a different modality of stimuli.
Yeah.
I think there is interesting work in motor imagery research with expert athletes that shows something very similar in the motor domain. So sounds elicit anticipated motor response in the absence of the visual stimulus or whatever. There are multiple combinations of this showing that expertise in a certain domain allows you to bootstrap better, anticipate better, obviously, be less surprised, and also simulate similar, like your expertise in the domain of a certain action, for example, will extend to different type of actions, which I guess, I don't know if that's exactly what you were saying, but it's something that made
I guess it's an important part of it.
Yeah.
I think one of the ones was with professional tennis players versus people who just watch tennis and don't play it.
Yeah,
and the activity in the motor cortex was stunningly different.
Exactly.
Right. So we're at about an hour and a half. Is there anything that you would like to bring up that we didn't get to talk about yet?
We could talk forever.
Yeah, that definitely.
That's nice.
But if there's anything pressing where you're like, oh, I really want to talk about this aspect of my work or anything like that.
No, I think we talked about memory. We talked about engagement. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with this.
Cool. And one thing that we try to ask everybody that comes on is where do you see the field going that you're working in?
Wow.
And it can also be coupled with why are you doing the work that you do? Right. Is it particularly driven around cognition or particularly driven around music or the experience that you're trying to uncover? What is it to you?
There were many questions in there. I'm going to start with the first one. Where's the field going? I hope it's going somewhere specific. I hope it's going towards a more comprehensive understanding of the human condition. And I'm not always convinced, but I'm always very buoyed and motivated when I go to a conference and see how much is being done and how much from how much is addressed from different perspectives. So I think it's going there. And
the human condition broadly.
The human condition.
Yeah,
broadly,
cool.
Yeah, I think this is also kind of what drives me. It was this general curiosity about how we work as humans. So in that sense, my interest is from the cognitive perspective. But at the same time, the way I fell into it is from the musical perspective, through my having tried to become a classical pianist. And the way music is viewed at music conservatories is very much as the text, yeah? So music is this. And then we, in the classical sense, become interpreters of it. But even when I was in that field, I always thought that's not true. And music is actually what's in the mind of the person who listens to it. And so that's how I started. But yeah, so I guess even then, starting from the musical perspective, I became a cognitive science person. Yeah.
Right on. I guess we can end it there in that case. Thank you so much, Anja, for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.